Hey. You know, a community that always comes out, commits their time to learn and represent on important issues. And I really appreciate everybody that's here tonight. I'm Cindy Abbott. I'm president of Pacifica's Environmental Family. Other PEF board members here this evening are Roy Ernst at the door, Margaret Goodale also at the door, and Jim Kremer here, who's helping out with AV tonight. We'd like to welcome Elise Lester with Assembly Member Mark Berman's office. I don't think a relation to our presenter, just a coincidence. We're pleased to see some of our city elected officials here too. We've got Mayor Sue Vaterlos. Mayor Pro Tem Sue Beckmeyer, who also serves as the chair of the California Coastal Cities Group with the League of California Cities and is part of the Coastal Commission's Local Government Working Group. Have Council Member Christine Bowles here as well. And they represent districts 1, 5, and 2, respectively. And I recall that when we were having to create the districts here in Pacifica, that it was really important that as many as possible touched the coast and Highway 1, because it's such an important part of our city. So the only one that doesn't touch the coast is District 4, which is in the back of the valley. And our other two council members wanted to be here tonight, Council Member Beer and Big Stick, but they had other city obligations this evening. I think we also have Samantha Hauser, Chair of our Planning Commission. I can't see everybody. And from our Open Space and Parkland Advisory Committee, Ellen and Joanne are here too. Pacifica's Environmental Family was first formed in the 1980s by a group of environmentally aware Pacificans with a mission to promote the discovery of and caring for our wealth of natural resources. The long-standing focus of our programs has been on education. In recent years, we've held City Council's candidate forums on environmental issues, hosted films, many talks on sea level rise. You may have been at some of those in years past. Outdoor programs during king tides, and a lot more. This program's been on our mind for a while, particularly when the Coastal Act turned 50. But sometimes things come together at just the right time, and that's what's happened here tonight. Because we have a greater urgency now as discussions have ramped up with the long-running update to the City of Pacifica's Local Coastal Land Use Plan, the LCLUP, and things are beginning to heat up again. There are a series of city plan meetings that will continue on the draft LCLUP, but that's not what we're going to be digging into the details here of tonight. That's for the city to be doing. But we will be talking about the Coastal Act, the California Coastal Commission, public trust doctrine, and how all of these things are intertwined with the need for the California coastal cities to have a plan for our precious California coast, something that we all love. Recent legislation, in fact, AB 227, presented by Assemblymember Laird and signed into law by the governor, recently requires all cities to have a sea level rise plan by 2034. And eligibility for funding will be prioritized based on those that have one. So a really important thing that we're talking about. As you came in, either in the back or on some chairs, they're blank question cards. No, it's not magic writing. These are for you to write down questions if you have one. There's pens and pencils in the back if you don't have one. And throughout the program, we'll come by standing at the edge of the aisles and collect them. We have a small team of question curators over here that will group the questions by subject, and they'll either provide a consolidated question or we'll ask the verbatim question, but our goal is to be able to cover as many topics and as many themes as possible tonight. And we're really looking forward to putting Dr. Lester on the spot. We appreciate your input and therefore welcome all questions that will inform, are civil, and of course the tough ones that Pacifica is known for. And that's relevant to this program. Again, if you have a question for city staff or city government, this isn't the place for it tonight because we're not city staff or city government. In the back, if you did it, we have a place for you to hang your haiku on the climate crisis, sea level rise, erosion. If you took part in that creative project, there's also blank forms if you'd like to take one home. We have a small booklet back there too called Sea Change, Creating Space for Fear-Free Conversations About Sea Level Rise. It's $10 that goes to Sanchez Art Center, who produced the book as part of a community engagement project that took place from 2019 to 2021 and documents neologisms or new words created here in Pacifica to express individual feelings about sea level rise, managed retreat, and similar issues. So again, those are in the back. We welcome our friends from Surfrider who also have a flyer in the back. And there's also flyers out I'd like to share with you about another upcoming program that will be on March 3rd, beginning at 1 o'clock at a venue to be announced soon, where the Pacifica Historical Society, Pacifica Climate Committee, Pacifica's Environmental Family, and others are bringing LA Times environmental reporter and author Rosanna Shaw to town to talk for a talk that we've titled Pacificans Against the Sea, ? And her book, though, is called California Against the Sea. If you haven't read it yet, it's really a good read, stories, and no surprise. Rosanna's been here many times, has been LA Times photographers, and so Pacifica is a featured chapter in the book. So if you haven't get this, go over to Florey's local bookstore, get a copy, read it, and then come to the talk on March 3rd. Okay. As you can see, we have our local TV station, Pacific Coast TV, Channel 26. Yay! And we really appreciate their time being here so that once we have the video all together, we can share the program with even more people. It'll be on their YouTube channel, and we'll also have it available via our Pacifica's Environmental Family website, and along with a list of additional resources on the Coastal Act and the Coastal Commission. A final logistical note, really important one. Restrooms, 2 in the back there. If the door is closed and it's locked, someone's in there. There's also 2 if you go out the door, turn to your right, you'll see a door that I'll go open in a minute that says East Gallery, and there's 2 restrooms over there too. There's also water and some little PEF swag over there too. So I told you we've had a lot of programs in the past, and in some of those programs, when we were talking about open space, we began with a land acknowledgement, recognizing the indigenous people who cared for this place before we were here. But we're not doing that tonight. The idea of living so close to the ocean versus visiting it while residing at a safer distance wasn't part of that culture. And the idea of personal property rights would have been foreign versus a sense of shared community responsibility. Our Western ways and how we conduct public discourse, and I'm not putting this on our city staff or our local government here, it's how the public process has evolved, has moved away from the intention of having a civil public common where issues were debated and decided together that would achieve the broadest community good. It was at a meeting of the California Coastal Commission's Local Cities Working Group a year ago that Dr. Lester, our speaker tonight, mentioned a book, Community and the Politics of Place. It highlights through history and with examples from Western states, including Montana, we're not unique in this issue, how our public process doesn't really allow us to find that commonality, and instead pits neighbors against each other with 2 to 3 minutes to cast out our opinions. Who's done that? Okay, probably everybody in this room. So without the avenue of really providing enough time and place to truly communicate with each other, we're not really listening, we're not hearing, and we're not working together for solutions. But we actually do have common ground. We all value the coast, the beaches, the privilege we have to live by it. But we're not always allowed to gather together to find that commonality and instead turn to blaming each other's, both individuals and public agencies. And instilling a sense of fear and anger is all too common. That's understandable. It's a human defense in the face of change and uncertainty, but it's not really helped us to move forward. Instead, it just keeps us polarized. So we're hopeful that tonight we can begin a more meaningful approach, transparently sharing factual information. We wanted and welcomed all to attend this meeting. No secrets, no closed doors, open to everyone, so that we can build some common understanding, and with that shared knowledge, move forward in a positive way to find real solutions for the city that we all care about. Okay, now to the good part. I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Charles Lester. He's the director of the Ocean and Coastal Policy Center in the Marine Science Institute at UC Santa Barbara, where he researches, writes, and advises about sea level rise, coastal resilience, and other aspects of coastal law, policy, and management. Charles previously worked for the state of California and the California Coastal Commission for 20 years, quite an accomplishment, including serving as the agency's 4th executive director from 2011 to 2016. Previously, he was an assistant professor of political science at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he taught environmental law and policy with a focus on public lands governance and coastal zone management. He received his PhD and JD from UC Berkeley and a BA in geochemistry from Columbia University. Charles is an expert in integrated coastal management and California coastal law and policy. He has extensive experience in California, including managing and directing hundreds of coastal planning and regulatory projects for the Coastal Commission. In 2015, he led the agency's completion of California's first comprehensive land use guidance for addressing sea level rise and coastal protection of the outer coast. He speaks regularly on coastal management, adaptation, and resilience, including taking part in congressional briefing on West Coast resilience. At this time, I'm so delighted to bring up to the podium Dr. Charles Lester.
Thank you, Cindy. How's the sound? Okay?
Yeah.
Great. I guess I'm being put on the spot, but I don't see any spot here, so. And I didn't know there was a haiku assignment, so I just wrote one here for the overarching theme. Sea level rising, how do we adapt now? Collaboration. I believe that's a 575. All right. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here tonight, and it was a great beginning to the talk. Many themes that resonate with what I've been thinking about over the years. In that 20 years with the Coastal Commission, I was up here quite often, know many of you, and understand some of the issues here. There's a lot of them that I don't understand, and so it's always fun to have a dialogue about these things. But I'm going to talk at a higher level about the Coastal Act and the Coastal Commission, which was the request initially to help talk about the role of that law and agency in Pacifica and with some of the challenges you're facing. So hence the title, The People's Law, the California Coastal Act, and the California Coastal Commission. How do we adapt now? So I often start my talks about the Coastal Act by observing a couple big picture things. One is There's this 40-mile stretch of coast that most of you probably know between Half Moon Bay and the city of Santa Cruz. And it looks largely like this aerial here. Undeveloped agricultural land, natural resources, parks, not a lot of development, right? On the other hand, in the Bay Area, you have over 8 million people just like 20 miles over this hill, right, over from the coast side. So how did we do that? How did we not develop this 40-mile stretch of coast and protect it for agriculture, natural resources, recreation, when there's so many people so close? Well, the Coastal Act is one of the reasons why we have that situation that we do. And so I think it's important to remember when you're thinking about issues at the local level, how we have accomplished something quite amazing in the larger scheme of both our nation and the globe. And people look to California as a leader in how to think about coastal protection and how to implement it. The other point I like to make is we often get into these fights about economy and environment, and I think if California's coastal program stands for anything, it stands for that you can have both. And in fact, one of the reasons we have such a strong economy in California is because we have a strong coastal economy, and one of the reasons that's strong is because we have decided to protect our coast. And so people come here to visit the coast, to enjoy the coast. All of you enjoy the coast, and there's a lot of money under that, right? $45 billion a year by some measures, just related to the coastal economy. So it's important to realize that these things can come together. I've had the privilege of working with some people in Chile in the last several years, and they've invited me to come talk to them about how California has managed its coast, because they're trying to improve coastal conservation on that coast. And they want to learn from what California has done, how they could think about doing a better job of protecting that coastline. And I don't know if you realize this, but their coastline is 3 times as long as California. It's as if California went from Alaska to the tip of Baja, right? So tremendous area and a lot to do, but a real honor to bring the knowledge that I have and the experience that we have in California to another place like that. So where did it all start in California? Well, it really goes back before the Coastal Commission to the political movement in San Francisco Bay, which created the Bay Conservation Development Commission. And this was a representation in the late 60s about what people thought was happening to the bay, and that if we continued to fill it, that pretty soon it would be a river, effectively. And so the public advertising was, do we want a bay or do we want San Francisco River? And that was kind of the motivating force by, we need to protect the bay, we need to stop the dumping of landfill material, all kinds of dredged material, and do something about that. We created a program to protect the bay. It's that program that became the basis for the coastal protection program that we put in place. Other things going on, we had the Santa Barbara oil spill. Everyone knows about that, and it was really one of the major forces behind the environmental movement in the United States. We had population growth shooting through the roof post-World War II. So if you see that curve and how it takes off after the World War II period, tremendous growth in California and particularly along the coastline. One of the things that growth did was start to wall off our coastline to our use. And so this is a shot of Malibu in 1972, and you can see already that there was this beginning of a cheek to jowl development right along the shoreline. People were upset about that. They couldn't get to the beach like they used to be able to. This is a cartoon from 1972, Dennis the Menace, who 50 years ago was saying, I went to the beach, but it was gone, right? So this is our concern over 50 years ago. We had industrial development that had been happening in various places. We had new nuclear plants being proposed, like in Bodega Bay, Davenport, down the coast here. People were concerned about what was happening and what the changes they were seeing. And so we passed an initiative, Prop 20. In 1972, it established an interim coastal commission that was put in place to control development while the legislature thought about how to do something more permanently. It was quite successful as an initiative. 55% of the statewide electorate voted for it. You can see San Mateo County at about 56% approval. Only 3 counties in the north did not vote to have the coastal program put in place, so a very popular law. One of the things that I point out about the success of the coastal program to other places is these core ideas. One, it had a bold vision. That vision was the coast belongs to all the people, present and future. And we talk a lot about that today, but it was actually the core underpinnings 50 years ago. And that the way to implement management was to have a sustainable balance between uses within the constraints of the environment. So this idea of environmental constraints was at the core. The people declared in that initiative that the coast was a distinct and valuable resource, again, belonging to all the people, and that permanent protection was important for not just present, but future generations. So a pretty fundamental vision right from the start. The other thing we did was create a coastal plan for the legislature to consider. This one's seen a little bit of use. It's actually fallen in half now. But it looked at the whole coastline. It identified issues up and down the coast, land uses, and a direction for us to head, potentially under the coastal law. And I love the high-tech mapping that they did in the back here, little fold-outs with the fold-out legend, all the maps color-coded. And so it's like a 1970s technology for the GIS that we use today. But we did a plan. That was the point. And it was based on broad public participation, hundreds of public hearings, including in Pacifica. The coastal law that came out of this plan was actually quite strong, but also broad. So it mandated the protection of natural and human-based coastal resources across all of these issue areas: public access, wildlife, special communities, habitat, scenic views, coastal agriculture, wetlands, and priority land uses like boating and fishing, things that had to happen on the coastal zone. Another important piece of that coastal legislation was that it required development to get a permit. And the second piece of that, which you all are grappling with, is that local governments were required to prepare local coastal plans to implement the state law. So those were 2 key ideas. Development needs a permit. We're going to start paying attention to it and ask questions about it. And local government is going to be the primary implementation mechanism through these land use plans. Of course, those have to be approved by the Coastal Commission, but more on that later. The coastal law created the Coastal Commission to plan for and regulate development along the coast in a public forum. So public participation is a fundamental value within that legislative framework. They meet every month. At the beginning, they were meeting weekly, if you can believe that. And regional commissions were also part of it. Then they went to bi-weekly, then monthly. Now I think they finally were able to eliminate the January meeting, so once a year they don't meet. But monthly, up and down the coast, every item that's of significance comes to them in a public hearing. You can go and do your 2 to 3 minutes that we heard about, right? The coastal law recognizes that there's this integral connection between land use and the sea, that interface. It defined a coastal zone. That was a political definition. It ebbs and flows up and down the state. These are a couple examples. Coastal zone in Morro Bay actually covers most of a watershed. So very early articulation of that idea of watershed planning. Coastal zone in Malibu, however, is up to the ridgeline, and then when it gets down to the city of LA, it narrows dramatically. And that's a pretty common occurrence in urban areas. So the legislature decided that, well, the state doesn't need to be involved so much in these more inland urbanized areas. We're concerned with the coastal zone, forces that influence change along the shoreline. That's, of course, Pacifica's coastal zone on the right. And you can see it essentially, except for that little bump out, and maybe somebody here knows the rationale behind that. I don't know that history. But other than that little bump out, it basically follows Highway 1. That's your coastal zone. Another core idea, it presumes a partnership between the state and local governments. We have 76 coastal governments, 15 counties, 62 cities. All of them are supposed to have an LCP. So the Coastal Commission is doing this dialogue and working on LCPs with each of those local governments. But it doesn't work unless you have that collaboration between the two levels of government. Another important idea, there's a relative political independence and authority built into the way the Coastal Commission was created. So it's an agency like many other agencies we have, Coastal Conservancy, State Lands Commission, Parks and Recreation. But it has a staff that does all the professional work, makes recommendations to the commission. The commission itself, though, doesn't report solely to the governor, like many agencies. They have 12 voting commissioners. The appointments of those commissioners are spread across the Senate, the Assembly, and the governorship. So there's a division of political control of the commission itself. And that was by design, so that there would be relative independence to consider the substance of the law and the facts of any particular case, and do that with the discretion of a commission, an independent commission implementing the Coastal Act. Another core idea I like to emphasize is that science and facts matter to this agency. We have a lot of cynicism about how government decisions get made sometimes, but I can tell you the Coastal Commission is has a professional staff. They take the science seriously. And I'm not saying that politics doesn't matter, but science matters too. And so this is just one example where in considering a desalination plant in Huntington Beach, they went through some very technical analysis to understand the biological impacts of a potential seawater intake and outfall to marine life and the biota down there, right? But very technical science that shapes what they decide to do. And finally, maybe perhaps the most important piece of the puzzle is it's an agency that's premised on public law, right? It's a public law exercise. And by that I mean rule of law matters. Public law, transparency, judicial review are fundamental parts of the process. So they're subject to judicial review like every other agency, but that is an important piece of that puzzle. Here you can see what was perhaps maybe the largest hearing they've ever had, which is the toll road hearing in Orange County back in 2008. They held it at the Del Mar Fairgrounds. There were like 1,000 or more people there. Most of them there in opposition to this project. That's the commission you see sitting up there listening to all the testimony. Can you imagine 2 to 3 minutes from all those people? Anyway, it was an all-day hearing. Eventually the commission voted 7-5, I think, to not approve the project. But it's an example of how this process can and arguably should work. All right, so let me just give you some big picture examples of what we've done with this law. One of the core ideas of the Coastal Act is that we should concentrate new development in places that were already developed. So we were trying to get at this problem of sprawl. And the way we did that was through land use planning. And if you are a policy wonk or a land use planning wonk, and some of you probably are because you're here tonight, right? Land use plans just tell you what you can do, where, and how intensely you can do it, right? And this is an example from Cambria where there's an urban limit line in the plan. On one side of that line you can develop the yellow zoned urban area. Doesn't really look yellow from here, but on the other side is agriculture. Less intense, no urban development. Here's that line in 1972, the tree line there in Cambria. Here's that line today. All right, it worked. We're respecting the line. We've had a lot of development, right? A lot of infill development, but we didn't develop in the rural area where the plan said you shouldn't develop. These are other examples. Dillon Beach in Marin County. Same basic footprint today. Cayucos in San Luis Obispo County. Same basic footprint. Pismo Beach. All of these places where we put in plans with lines and followed them basically north of Santa Barbara. Amazingly, almost the same urban footprint in the coastal zone that we had 50 years ago, for the most part. This is Pacifica. It's a little different situation, as you know, but that's 1972 on the left, or sorry, in the middle, on the left on my screen. You can see there's no seawall yet. There's not even a pier. And today, or 2019, I think, you can perceive the densification, the intensification of development within the urban area. And there hasn't been that much development up around the hillsides around the urban area. Public access, another core value of the Coastal Act. We were losing our access to our beaches. People were concerned about that. Obviously, a very important aspect of what it means to be in California or a Californian, right? The California coast is iconic. One of the things we've done over 40 years is use this legal mechanism of getting easements along the beach when people will receive development permits. So this is an example from Malibu. All those colored rectangles along the beach there are legal requirements that were placed on permits to either build new homes or redevelop homes. And in exchange, the property owners would dedicate the beach in front of their homes for public use. And that circle there, the oval, is actually what's called a vertical easement. So in some cases, we've secured the ability to get from the first highway along the shoreline to the shoreline, a vertical connection, which is also very important when you have wall-to-wall houses, right? So this is an example from what's called Billionaires Beach down in Malibu, the Geffen Accessway. The beach on the before is empty. The beach after we opened this accessway has people on it. People can actually go there and also be a billionaire, or at least pretend to be. We've also secured access up and down the coast in places that in many other places in the world you would not ordinarily be allowed to go. Right? So you can go to the beach at the Montage Resort in Laguna Beach and go down to the beach on a required access way. When they built the hotel, they had to get a permit. The permit required the access. Pebble Beach. If you haven't been, go down and visit Stillwater Cove at Pebble Beach. You can park there, courtesy of the Coastal Commission required parking spaces, and go hang out on the beach at the 5th hole. An amazing setting, right? You won't feel comfortable driving in there and looking for the parking and then walking around, but once you get there, it's nice, right? I mean, some of you, I don't want to prejudge, some of you may feel comfortable, but I don't feel comfortable sometimes. On the right here, all those green trails, those are public trails on the Trump National Golf Course. So even our former President Trump had to bow down to the Coastal Commission and provide access to the shoreline, right? All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here, or begin to anyway. Coastal hazards. One of the ideas in the Coastal Act was maybe we shouldn't develop in hazardous places. Right? New development should minimize hazards, risk to property and life, right? Makes sense, right? So one of the core ideas that was often implemented is, well, maybe we should move a little further back from that eroding shoreline. And this is an example in Pismo Beach, pre-Coastal Act house on the left, a required setback for a new subdivision that got a coastal permit on the right. In between the shoreline and the subdivision is dedicated public access. So that was an approach that has been taken for 40 years now in our coastal zone for new development. Along with that is something that I would call a rolling easement approach, where, for example, this new house that was approved in Trinidad, the Coastal Commission said you need to set back as far as you can, because in this case it's highly erodible. Often there's a time limit put on a setback calculation, so make your house safe for 75 years, for example. In this case, they couldn't do that, but we put them back as far as we could, and then we required that they assume the risk of being there, agreed to never build a seawall in the future, and potentially remove that development if necessary. Right? So that's an obligation that comes with building a new development in an inherently hazardous place. The problem has been with existing development. And there's a lot there which maybe we can get into later. But the Coastal Act also said if you were an existing structure, you could potentially get a seawall, all things otherwise being addressed, if you were in danger from erosion. So it's been very difficult for the Coastal Commission to stop the proliferation of shoreline structures in places where we already had a lot of urban development. And that essentially is a core problem that we're dealing with now with sea level rise, is that we're really inheriting these development footprints that were pre-Coastal Act. Pacifica's development pattern was established before the Coastal Act, right? The city of Santa Cruz, all of these places in Southern California, they were built and subdivided well before we decided to protect the coast. This is Solana Beach, where this beautiful cliff geology in 1989 is now this, what I call a faux Disneyland kind of wall. And that's just happening regularly now in Solana Beach. Pacifica. There's the Esplanade Beach in 1975. There's no seawall development. There's a wide beach, an eroding bluff. That's the same beach today. Mostly armored with riprap, the seawall up at Land's End, but largely armored because there was existing development there that became endangered and then received a seawall. So Pacifica has experienced the same thing. Somebody requested that I show this photo again because I've shown it in the past up here. But Land's End, right? You're all familiar with what's been happening up there probably. Erosion can be pretty dramatic, and it's not like this incremental thing usually. It happens in episodes. Big chunks will fall away in El Nino years or big storm seasons. And so you need to be on the lookout for that. So this is what happened in that 2009-10 year. Up to 90 feet in places at Land's End just fell away. I always get bummed out because I wonder what happens to those 3 dogs that are down there. You know, they're like... Anyway, they probably made it out. Esplanade Apartments, of course, has been well analyzed and in the national news every time there's a storm, a big storm, right? We get the shot of the Esplanade Apartments starting to fall off the cliff. And so there's been a lot of attention at the erosion there. And you, again, likely know the story that we've had a demolition of those apartment buildings on Esplanade because they were so endangered they were no longer habitable. And Pacifica in that location has become an example for many of what we would call unplanned retreat. So we retreated there, right? We took the buildings out, but nobody planned that. Or if they did, they were doing it very carefully, and so I don't know where they're doing it. But those places were not planned to be removed, but they are removed. And your city's still in litigation about that, at least one of those properties, and the fallout from that. So that's kind of the background of the Coastal Act and coastal hazards. But now what about climate change, right? Sea level rise is happening, and it's going to keep happening. Even if we turned off our CO2 emissions tomorrow, it's going to happen for hundreds of years. It may reduce more, but it's still going to happen. So the message there is that we need to plan for it, and we need to figure out what we're going to do about it. Some of the data for California, submergence of maybe 83% of our tidal wetlands by 2110, half of our habitat areas underwater, 2/3 of Southern California beaches might be lost, lacking any intervention to the contrary by 2100. Can you imagine Southern California losing 2/3 of its beaches? I mean, that's partly what Southern California is known for. So Pacifica has done a lot of great analysis. This is just one snapshot of some flooding analysis that was done a few years back in the vulnerability assessments, showing some of the potential vulnerability from about up to almost 6 feet of sea level rise that Pacifica could experience. I'm going to spend the rest of the time really talking about coastal erosion and not flooding, although we can talk about flooding later if you want. One of the things I think it's important to recognize here is that you're not alone, right? This is a shared problem statewide. We've got communities with development on the beaches and on bluffs that are eroding, that are going to have increased erosion. All of these places are struggling with the same kinds of questions that you're struggling with. One of the dynamics that we're concerned about, and if you want to understand a core thing that the Coastal Commission cares about, you got to think about what happens to beaches when you build seawalls. And it's been known for a long time that when you build a beach build a seawall on an eroding shoreline, eventually the beach is going to disappear. So this is this idea of the slide here on the left is from an LA Times, or maybe that's from the Coastal Commission, but there's a illustration of it with a hotel in Monterey where you can see how much narrower the beach is in front of the hotel. That hotel was one of the developments that was cited for why we needed a coastal act, by the way. Well, we don't want any more beaches or beach hotels in the sense of a hotel right on the beach. So people talk about this thing called the coastal squeeze. And you can look up and down the coast and see it happening everywhere. This is a Capistrano State Beach. There's a revetment protecting a parking lot, a narrow beach in front, immediately up coast. The beach is much wider because it's been able to continue eroding or moving inland with the dynamic of a receding shoreline. This is Montara. This is one of my favorite examples. 1972 at the top. Continuous lateral access, much like you saw in Pacifica in 1975 in Esplanade. Today, you have armoring on both sides of this beach that's still there. That was a vacant lot that wasn't armored, but you still have a beach because the shoreline is able to erode inland. In front of the armoring, you don't have the beach. Here is Rockaway. In the 1940s, there wasn't any rock there. They took it away, I guess. There was a beach and a back beach. There was a dune system of pretty not manipulated, all right? And that's, of course, what it looks like today. And for some of you technical folks, that's a very high-tech program I used to approximate where I think the beach wants to be. If that development wasn't there, right? You can see how there's no beach in front of the revetment, right? You can't walk any longer along that beach. And I think that that square building at the back on the right, or the left-hand photo is that square building just to the right of the whitish coloration. Anyway, we know what happens when we build seawalls. This is what's often called passive erosion. This is Esplanade. You can see in 79, again, no seawalls. 2010, we had put down revetments in front of the apartment buildings. And also at this one location where people get access to put the rocks on the beach. You can see the difference in the beach width, right, in front of the unarmored section. You still have a beach there. This is looking from the top. So we know what happens when we build seawalls on eroding shorelines. This is USGS sea level rise projection data showing you the shoreline, where the shoreline would want to be in this section of coast if there wasn't armoring, with 50 centimeters or half a meter of sea level rise, 1 meter of sea level rise, and 2 meters of sea level rise. So the latest science now is maybe thinking, 1 meter of sea level rise is not unreasonable to think for 2100. So there's a lot of continuing erosion pressure coming, and the science is getting increasingly better at showing us how that might unfold. So I'm going back to my haiku. How do we adapt now, right? Well, we've been around the block here in Pacifica on that question, right? This was from 2019, 2020, when we were talking about alternatives of protection, accommodation, managed retreat. And managed retreat, of course, set off the firestorm and put things on hold a little bit, and now we're back at it here. So questions are being raised about, well, what is the right response to this trend that is happening and that is going to continue to happen? And I'm not saying it's easy. It's a difficult set of questions. But I want to talk just for a little bit here about some examples elsewhere, different contexts, different things at play, but examples of how we have retreated in California. Stillwell Hall at Fort Ord in Monterey County. They spent years and years and years trying to protect this historic building from the fort. Eventually, they determined they couldn't save it anymore. They proposed to demolish the building. The Army did. The Coastal Commission said, fine, that's great, demolish it, but please take your rocks with you when you go. All right? So, and they did. That's the great thing about the military, right? You tell them to do something, they do it. Yes, sir. And they know how to do it. And the great thing about this example, too, is it's in some ways like Pacifica's geology, right? Very sandy, very erodible, and no beach access in front of that revetment, no beach. You take the revetment out, the beach recovered pretty nicely in a very short period of time. It's now a state park. That parking lot there you see is a state parking lot. I'm sure that they're going to move that back when they need to. Another example from Half Moon Bay, the Coastal Commission was dealing with this emergency revetment that the hotel put down to protect the golf course. The Coastal Commission said, well, I don't really think you need that revetment to protect the golf course. Plus, we have to make difficult decisions about trade-offs. Maybe this one is an easy one. Right? Should we put a revetment on the beach to protect the golf hole, or should we make the golf hole a little more challenging? Right? Which I don't play golf, but I understand that that's one of the main challenges of golf, right? The hazards. So this is a good thing, right? We're just making the hole a little more challenging. Anyway, we can restore beaches by removing revetments. Down in Santa Barbara, the Ritz-Carlton or the Bacara Resort has removed the beach house that was originally built when the hotel was built in the late 80s. You can see the hotel there in the background. It remains to be seen what will happen with the hotel itself, but in the meantime, they did remove the beach house under the terms of the permit. Also in Santa Barbara County, the community of Isla Vista, which is Santa Barbara County jurisdiction, they've been implementing a set of LCP policies that require essentially, it's complicated, but essentially require the systematic removal of the seaward sides of these buildings as they become endangered. And you can see the line there representing how the buildings have been cut back, especially on the right. And that's all basically student housing. So again, it's a complex set of factors, but it's an example of how you can use ordinances and serious implementation of those ordinances to encourage and facilitate the movement back along a developed shoreline. One of my favorite examples that I got to work on became one of my career-defining projects, right? Because I did the emergency permit with Caltrans in 1998 to put the revetment down you see at the top here to protect Highway 1 in San Luis Obispo County. An important transportation corridor, an important public access resource. Of course we're going to protect it in the short run. And in the meantime, we told Caltrans that we would like you to start evaluating how you can move the highway back so you don't need a revetment. And they said, well, it'll take us 15 years. We said, great, let's get started. And we did that, and we gave them 5-year permits. We came back every year. How's it going? How's the work program working? And gradually, they got to the point of redesigning and relocating the highway. So that's why I said it was career defining. In '98, I worked on that permit for the revetment. In 2014, I was the director when we approved the permit for the realignment of the highway. And then I got to go down and visit it. And of course, when I visited, it had already been taken back by the elephant seals in the area. So restoration at work, relocation, retreat. This is another great example from Morro Bay. They needed to develop and redevelop their wastewater treatment plant. It happened to be in a floodplain We said, that's not really a good idea. Why don't you look for a different place? They said, okay. It wasn't that easy, right? There was a lot of discussion, and it wasn't cheap, but they did relocate the plant. It's now open. It's in that location that you see circled on the ag land inland. And actually, one of the benefits of that movement was it became more than a wastewater treatment plant. It's now a water recycling facility. So a win-win. Became a more holistic project. This is an example from right near the campus, actually on the campus. UCSB took this golf course that had been there since the 60s and basically restored it to its former estuary footprint. So again, it's not houses or commercial development, but it was a golf course, and we did restore it. It's now functioning quite amazingly as an extension of the estuary there, the slough. And then one of my other favorite examples, the city of Monterey has this program, they call it the Window on the Bay. And it really started back in the 30s or 40s. The city council there said, you know what, we have this vision, long-term vision of having our shoreline be open for everyone to enjoy, Oceanside Park. So they identified this area here, which in 1972 at the top was a mixed commercial, auto body shops and smaller scale commercial development. They said, this we're going to turn into the Window on the Bay. And gradually, over decades, they worked with willing sellers, they bought properties, they demolished the buildings, and today it's a park. It's opened up, right? So it's a great example of how you can systematically work with willing property owners and the market to transform a piece of the shoreline for another great public purpose. Now, the irony is they didn't know they needed that space for sea level rise, right? So now they're talking about it again, and they're also doing some more visioning. And this is from some of the work that's happened a few years back and has stalled like a lot of work. But one of the options, of course, is build a wall. That yellow line there. Well, we could try to protect the shoreline, that major transportation corridor. That'll have some benefits, but it'll also have some downsides, like no beach. Can you still hear me? Oh. Another vision is to not build a wall, but work with the water and where the water wants to go. So this alternative would allow the ocean to reconnect with the former estuary there. And it's highlighted in the graphic. You probably can't read it. It says 2 miles of new coastline and bike trails. Right? So not only are you protecting the beach, you're gaining beach by saying, hey, let's work with the water, and maybe we can build a viaduct for the road so we keep that transportation corridor. And it's a different way to adapt. But it's about using our imaginations to think about what could the community look like? How could we redevelop? How could we transform things to meet shared objectives? Of course, there's private property, and this is one of the more difficult discussions that we have to have. Martin's Beach down the road here is a good example where the legislature itself has amended the State Lands Commission statute to say that the State Lands Commission may acquire easements at Martin's Beach for public access. So we've gone over that political hurdle of the idea of using eminent domain for a public access purpose. Of course, it's hung up, I think, on lack of funding and whether anyone's really going to pursue that politically. Half Moon Bay has been implementing a lot retirement program using eminent domain, in part to protect these parcels that are in danger from erosion eventually. And so they would rather not see those parcels develop with houses that would then need seawalls potentially. So they've been using eminent domain in there currently, and I believe they're in litigation about that right now. In a bigger picture, legal setting, and this is a little technical, but, and Cindy mentioned the public trust doctrine. There's this idea, and if you don't know, the public owns the land below the mean high tide, right? Those are called public tide lands. And they're held in trust for us, all of us. So all the land in Pacifica below the mean high tide is public trust. it's a common law doctrine that when you have a boundary that's moving, like a mean high tide line or a river bank that might erode and then accrete, erode and accrete, that the benefits and burdens of that movement of the line accrue to both sides. And so the bottom line in this case was the Army Corps of Engineers, believe it or not, sued the residents here for trespassing for that revetment on tidelands. And they said, you're on public trust lands, you need to remove that revetment unless you get our permission. And it went to the federal courts in the Ninth Circuit. The court ended up saying, well, both sides have a right to that moving boundary. It just so happens in this case, the boundary's moving, inexorably inland. And so in this case, the upland owners, the homeowners, can't put the revetment down and permanently fix the movement of that tide line unless they get the permission of the United States, or in this case, the tribal nation that was also a trustee. So it's an important concept, because one of the things I've talked about in other talks is about this idea of the public trust in more detail. And the fact of the matter is that public trust line is going to keep moving inland with sea level rise. So whether we like it or not, the tidelands, public tidelands, are going to be increasingly encroaching on what was private land, and maybe already are in some cases, like some of these revetments. And we're looking at a lot of conflict unless we figure out how to get ahead of that. Because as last I checked, there's about 40 million property owners in California on the tideland side who might have a concern if they start losing all of their beaches to the encroachment of private development. So something to think about. This is a shot of the case that's pending in Half Moon Bay, an example of conditions. I'd like you all to read that really small type. It's just an example that the Coastal Commission has started as part of that, an extension of that idea of conditions on permits for shoreline development, that a property owner has to accept a condition that says you may have to remove your development in the future if it's no longer located on private property due to migration of the public trust boundary. So we're trying to get ahead of that a little bit by telling people, in the future you might be on public land and you might not be able to stay. So these are just some details that come out of an article that I wrote with some others about these examples, and the point is to say that managed retreat is happening in forms, that it requires a vision for where you want to head. What's the pathway to that retreat? It takes a long time. It's expensive. It's often phased or sequenced over time, and maybe a hybrid of those. It involves infrastructure, commercial projects, not just homes. Retreat is happening at neighborhood scales over time, like Isla Vista. And it's often transformative, so when we decide to achieve some kind of new vision, we often see other kinds of benefits that come along with that. So the point is that it's not something that happens tomorrow. We're not asking people to move tomorrow. We're trying to implement programs over long periods of time to facilitate the adaptation of a community to achieve multiple shared objectives. And I'm not saying that's easy, or that there's people who are going to, lose property potentially that they are, emotionally vested in, maybe their life's investment. But the question is, what's the best thing for our shared interests along the shoreline, and what's the best way to achieve those shared interests so that everyone is taken care of? I know that one of the current topics in Pacifica is this idea of SRAs, special resiliency areas. We've been doing planning at multiple scales for a long time. Pacifica itself has already got an LCP that's structured around the eight areas along the coastline. When we worked on that LCP in 2018, the adaptation plan had customized strategies for each of those areas. recognizing the diversity along your shoreline. And so, this is one of the SRAs on the right-hand side here showing what's on the table now. I'm not going to go into those details right now, but the question is, what is the right scale and how should we respond to shoreline change? And it's not going to be uniform across the geography. All of these places have different issues happening, different development patterns, different geophysical trends. One of the things that a lot of communities are talking about in California is this idea of an adaptation pathway, where you would look at a situation and ask, okay, where are you headed? Where do you want to head with this? Well, if we want to save beaches, how can we save beaches while doing right by development? What's the pathway? And this is an example from Ventura County on the right, where they've got a sort of a sequence of steps. Well, first we're going to do some sand replenishment. When that doesn't work out and we start to see waves overtopping along the pedestrian pathway, then we're going to need to maybe build some little groins or something to start retaining sand more. And if that doesn't work, eventually then we're going to have to maybe pull back in some places. So it's a sequence of steps, and you're recognizing that this is not something that, again, happens like a light switch. It's something that's unfolding over time as conditions change, triggered by monitoring of environmental conditions. And so community engagement and visioning is, of course, really important in my view to this. Thanks for citing that, community and the politics of place, Cindy. It's nice to know that something I say sometimes gets noted. This is from back when you were working on the LCP in 2018. There's no doubt you guys are involved in the process, right? So the question is, how do you do that engagement and have those conversations in a way that is meaningful and allows people to share their ideas and identify our shared common interests? And I include the Coastal Commission in that dialogue. You can't have a dialogue without the Coastal Commission. Unless you go to Sacramento and change the law, you need to work with the Coastal Commission. So I'm just going to wrap up there by framing the challenge, which is, what is the future for Pacifica shoreline? What is the vision you have for it? If you enjoy beaches and you want to have beaches in Pacifica, where are those going to be? And how are you going to make sure they persist? At the same time that we recognize we need to protect development, we need to do right by the community interests and property. And so you need to figure out how you're going to try to make those trade-offs and balances between the different values and do it together. I'm not saying it's easy, but I don't see any other way to do it. So I'll stop there. Is this where the spot appears?
Yes.
Okay, if you haven't turned in a card yet and you do have a question, Margaret's walking around. She's got cards, pencils, we'll pick them up. And these two apparently go with each other. So where will California get enough money to compensate all the homeowners and business owners it throws off the coast? The partner question for that, because again, we're grouping them together. What rules and regulations govern private property owners trying to protect their oceanfront with riprap or seawalls?
Can you just repeat the first question, the last phrase?
To compensate all the home and business owners it throws off the coast. So the whole question is, where will California get enough money to compensate all the home and business owners it throws off the coast?
Yeah, that's a really great question. All the dimensions of that. In terms of the financing and the money involved, this is going to be hugely expensive even if there isn't compensation of private property in the sense of a takings, for example. It takes a lot of money to do this kind of thing. Pacifica's already spent a lot of money just dealing with the 3 apartment buildings on Esplanade. And you may not be aware of that, but it's costing you money to deal with that situation. The next step in that plan, I think, is to build a seawall to protect what's remaining there for public access purposes and to protect the road and infrastructure. That's going to cost money. Where is the city going to get that? And you've got 76 communities in California in that situation, and you've got 50 states, or not 50, but other inland states have their own challenges with wildfire and flooding, and so there's a lot of money on the table. And that's in part why you've seen things like the infrastructure bill that came out a few years back, which is has a lot of money dedicated to things like adaptation projects, living shorelines, infrastructure protection improvements. So people are recognizing that a lot of money is needed, and we're beginning to find more money for that. That's like anything that costs a lot of money. It's going to be a struggle to continue financing, I think, what's really going to be needed. The other side of that, though, is that all of these situations have benefits and costs, and depending on how they unfold, winners and losers. Some people pay for it, others are benefiting from it, right? So sometimes there's emergency funding available to build back or build back better. And that's public money, right? There's a lot of money going into beach replenishment, for example, nationally. You've probably seen in the news about what Florida does on a lot of its beaches, putting sand down repetitively to maintain their beaches. Who do you think pays for that? Well, usually we pay for about half of that at least, or 2/3, I forget, different equations, right? So it's federal tax dollar money paying to put sand on the beach. So when you think about, who's paying for things, you got to look at the whole picture and what the source of that funding is. In terms of the private property and takings, that's a difficult set of technical legal questions depending on the circumstances of a case, and so there may or may not be a legal takings in any particular situation. If there is, then you go through a legal process of determining what compensation might be owed. That's on the table right now in that Esplanade case, where one of the issues in front of the court is how much is that now vacant piece of property on Esplanade valued at? So how much will the city be having to pay if they continue with the eminent domain there?
So this might be another partner question for that, because it's finances, but on an infrastructure side. Are there examples of cities relocating underground infrastructure such as sewer and water lines? And could Pacifica get ballpark estimates from them? Are you aware of any instances of moving infrastructure in a significant way?
There are examples. I might have to think a little bit offline about the details, but some cases that come to mind, there's actually more sewer lines under beaches than you might think, right? State Parks has been systematic. It has a permit from the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s down in Santa Cruz County that requires them to remove an old, not in use anymore, sewer line from the beach when it becomes exposed. I should have put that picture in. I have a great picture from last year of the sewer line became exposed. It looks like a giant sandworm out of that dune, coming out of the beach. It was literally, this tall. And because it became exposed, State Parks had to remove it, a segment, and get it off the beach. So, yeah, we have examples of infrastructure being removed. State Lands Commission is requiring all kinds of oil and gas development to be removed down in Southern California. I'm not an engineer, but one thing I learned at the Coastal Commission is engineers can do anything, right? We ordered the Cliffs Hotel in Pismo Beach to remove a revetment. The hotel owner said, "Oh, we don't have a crane that can do that." our staff engineer, Leslie Ewing, now retired, said, oh, there's a crane that can do that. And so we said, do it, and they did it, right? You can dig things up and move them around. How much does it cost? That depends on, how deep it is and what else is involved in the trench and where you're moving it. And so it's really case by case, and I don't know the details of what the sewer line here, but I am sure there are people that could figure it out.
So here's an easy one. We'd like you to do all the work that we've been trying to do right now. What would be your recommended adaptation strategy for Pacifica against sea level rise, and why?
My recommended strategy?
Yes. What is the adaptation strategy you recommend for Pacifica, and why?
10 words.
Move to Colorado? I don't know. There are a lot of different ways you could slice it up. So I think is one thing. And don't hold me to any of this, but I referred before to the things that the Coastal Commission is concerned with in their mandate, and what they're presumably and inevitably going to be pushing for in their dialogues with the city. And so if you're talking about these SRAs, they're going to want to know, how does that strategy help us meet the goals of the Coastal Act that we need to meet? And an example, and this is a question that's being raised in a lot of communities, if you want the Coastal Commission to even contemplate what some would call exemptions for shoreline structures, or allowances for shoreline structures that might not ordinarily be allowed, they're going to need to see something on the other side of the equation. And it's going to need to be as tangible as the exemptions that are being written in. So I haven't thought about the details recently in Pacifica, but there are some places where perhaps the city could think about a managed retreat strategy in exchange for maintaining a line in other places, right? So look at your 6 miles of shoreline and ask, where could that happen? How could it happen? Or, short of that, think about some of the strategies that were developed in the adaptation plan and begin to take them seriously in the sense of a capital improvements program. So if you think sand replenishment and a groin might actually work to maintain a beach for 20 or 30 or 40 years while you figure out the next difficult step, then you need to put that in place in a more tangible form, so that people who are concerned about beaches can see that that actually has some meaningful action behind it.
And a good reminder, because we did a lot of work here in the city on the adaptation plan with a lot of help, and those documents I think are still out on the city's website, but a lot of work was done. As Dr. Lester said already, it already did break the city of Pacifica up into neighborhoods and areas, so based on the geography of the area. So because what might happen in North Pacifica with the tall bluffs is completely different what might need to be done in Lindemar. So that work was done, hasn't been looked at in a while, but it is available.
In my mind, I don't have the answer that you want, right? But one of the reasons I took a step back and looked at this was to start thinking about, okay, what if I want to do right by, housing in my community and commercial growth and profit in my community, and I want to have some beaches in my community? Where would you do it? How would you do it? I often talk about housing, for example. You can't talk about just the row of houses on the shoreline, or the affordable housing in the apartments that got demolished. You have to talk about housing at the community level and have a plan, a vision for how are we going to maintain affordable housing and housing of all types for the people in the community, and do right by what's happening along the shoreline. If the answer in Pacifica is, well, we're not so concerned about beaches, then maybe you don't need to go through that exercise. But I would ask everyone to think about that. Where do you think the beaches ought to be, and what are the strategies for maintaining them, even while you do the other things you care about?
Great. Okay, here's one. Actions by the California Coastal Commission are accused of being government overreach, or in some cases, even a regulatory taking. This seems certain to be litigated. Are there credible legal defenses to these challenges, including strong precedents?
Defenses to takings claims?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm familiar with that criticism of it being an overreach.
Respond to that part too.
As I said before, takings issues are case specific. They're complicated. They're shaped by judicial precedent all the way up to the Supreme Court. But generally, the questions on the table are, is there some sort of investment-backed expectation that's being taken by the government action, or the traditional taking is like just a physical taking of the property, and the Constitution is very clear. You can do that, right? We're allowed to take, the government is allowed to take property. You just have to pay for it. That's what the city of Pacifica is doing on Esplanade, through eminent domain, taking those properties, right? You just have to pay for it. So I think it's something that we ought to have in our toolbox to help deal with some of these difficult situations. We use eminent domain for a lot of things. I think they're doing it for the high-speed rail. People are losing their property so that we can build a high-speed rail. So it happens. Whether there's a takings in a particular regulatory action is again driven by the facts of, do they have a public interest and legal mandate to take the action? So are they trying to achieve something that's of broad public interest, like protecting beach access, for example? What was the investment-backed expectation? So then you get into questions like, how much did people invest in the property? What was the reasonable expectation for a return on the property? How much does the regulation affect the return on the property? And you can actually diminish the value of a property quite a bit under our legal rules without it being a takings. But those cases are all driven by the specifics in those situations. And then there are some exceptions. So when I talk about the public trust, under Supreme Court precedent, one of the ideas that was embedded at that level of the law was, well, if something was part of the original property bundle of rights, we talk about bundles of rights that come with our property, then maybe it's not a takings if you're trying to act on that particular thing. So, for example, a nuisance. I used to frame this question for undergraduates when I taught environmental law, which is, can you do anything you want with your property? And of course, it's like, yeah, we can do anything we want, right? And then I say, oh, really? Can I put a bunch of trash in my backyard and burn it every night? It's like, oh, well, that's different. That's because that's a nuisance, right? And we have laws that say you can't create a nuisance on your neighbors. And that would not be a takings to have a law that said you can't do that, because you're implementing nuisance law. Another example is the public trust, interestingly, because we think about the public trust as a common law right. And so there's this idea that I talked about a little bit, that inherent in your property right, if you're on an ambulatory boundary against the public trust, well, that public trust is a common law right that, in a sense, what's the word I'm looking for? It comes before your ownership right, or it's part of your ownership, that it's inherent that there's this public trust right. And so it's possible that if the state implemented regulations to protect the public trust, that would not be a takings, because it's an exception under the takings law.
It's It's really interesting. I mean, it's lots to think about. But we have a lot of money questions, and again, I think you've already kind of touched on to this one. So the question is, who would pay to remove properties along Beach Boulevard, and how far would it go? I think you've shown it's up to the community vision. Have you thought about, and what are your thoughts about the proposed law that has been before the governor on multiple occasions, but never made it didn't get signed by him, was approved 3 times, I think, by the legislator to have a revolving loan fund? Is that a possible way to fund removable of properties?
Yeah, so that law was floated twice and vetoed twice by the governor. Had great support in the legislature, overwhelming support, but then the governor vetoed it. It would have established a revolving loan program. Was my battery running low?
Well prepared, though, with the backup.
Right here?
If you do have any more questions, we'll have Margaret walk by again, pick up anything, get them to our question, folks.
Uh-oh.
Change the battery.
I don't think we need the slides anyway, but these bills would establish a revolving loan program. The money would be available to local governments, communities to essentially take these government loans and buy hazardous properties like shoreline property, and then potentially lease them back, for example, until such time as they needed to be removed. And this would be one way to finance the loan payment. And a lot of people are talking about this, what's sometimes called a buyout leaseback option. They discussed it in Imperial Beach a number of years ago as part of their adaptation planning. It hasn't been implemented yet. Other states are looking at this idea, and there's a lot of buyout programs in place, by the way, especially in federal flood management. State of New Jersey has a program called the Blue Acres program, where they've literally bought hundreds of parcels in wetland areas that were developed and are now regularly being flooded. So they've established a pretty systematic program for buying hazardous properties, and in some of those places, people are asking for buyouts, right? They're tired of being flooded every other year and having to go through that, and so they're saying, can you please help us with this situation? So part of me thinks that this might be a really great way to help make a transition in places that are inherently hazardous. And I was going to say that earlier, which is, I'm not an engineer or a coastal expert geologist, but I do wonder how, even if we do armor all of these spots in Pacifica, I do wonder how long that's going to last, how viable it is, right? And how expensive that's going to be if you think we can maintain seawalls and build them bigger, stronger, taller. Where does that stop, and does it work? I'll be really curious to watch how the shoreline protection along that Esplanade stretch functions over the coming decades. And the Beach Boulevard seawall now was built in 73, 74, 84, so now we need a new one. How many times do we do that? So where was I going with that? Where are you
going to spend your money?
Yeah, right, how are you going to spend your money? So I think that a buyout program can be a useful thing to think about. Another part of me, though, pauses because I'm not sure a buyout program subsidized by the public is the right strategy for some of our developed areas, and California has some of the most expensive real estate in the world. I'm not really interested in buying out mega mansions in Malibu. I think those people have the means to pay for those things themselves.
Yeah, so maybe a means testing.
Yeah, I think equity has to be part of it, right? Like all of our governmental programs, we have to think about ability to pay, equity in terms of distribution, and certainly we need I think part of the problem or the challenge is figuring out how to help everyone make a transition if a transition is needed.
So this one ties into that. Any other various types of solutions for at-risk properties that have worked with cities and governments as partners?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Any other types of solutions for at-risk properties that have worked with cities and governments as partners?
Well, one policy that I think we should embrace wholeheartedly really comes from economic theory, and that's disclosure. The theory of an efficient marketplace assumes you have perfect information, so you can't make an efficient trade unless you know everything about the thing you're buying. State of Hawaii has adopted in their state code a required real estate disclosure for sea level rise. We've been doing a lot of that at the local level and at the parcel level. So the Coastal Commission, as some of you know, has been requiring assumption of risk and recorded deed restrictions about the hazards on individual permits for 40, almost 50 years. That's a form of disclosure. And in some cases, we had written conditions where you had to actually include those disclosures in any kind of marketing. That's the right thing to do for people buying things in a marketplace. They should be able to understand what the risks, the costs of a particular transaction might be. And so we could do that in California. We could strengthen our disclosure law. It certainly should be part of your LCP, in my view. And part of that is the hazards overlay, for example. I get that it's going to affect property values, but don't we want properties to reflect their values?
And that's a big question here, that deed restrictions and everything. Does that also protect the city then, and not have it be the case like we have up in Esplanade right now, and the future owner? Right now, we've got a lot of questions out there on why is this going to be required and who is it protecting?
It can. You know, the deed restriction that the Coastal Commission has used for years has also an explicit provision that says, you know, they can't hold the state liable for any future damages from their decision to develop in this risky place. I was involved in another case down in Pebble Beach, different issue. It was about habitat restoration and a requirement to restore part of the property in an original permit. Some later purchaser learned that they were supposed to be doing that, and there was an enforcement case, and they were upset about that. They sued the Coastal Commission. The Coastal Commission said, well, it's in your deed. It's a requirement in your title. And they sued us anyway, went to court. The court said, well, it's in your title. You have a problem? Talk to the title agent. Right? So the lawsuit existed between the property owner and their title company, not between the state and the property owner.
And this is a similar one, and I think you already touched on the answer a bit before about takings. Is there any case law setting principle for homeowners in eroding situations? What does the government owe them?
There is case law. I'm not up to speed on the latest, greatest, and so I won't opine about what that might be, but there are cases out there that deal with hazards and what governments are required to do or not. Going back to the takings discussion, you know, what government owes them really depends on the facts of the case. And again, going back to those things about, you know, what's the public interest being implemented, what are the economic expectations that the property owner had. We know, and I have a pretty good understanding of how speculation works sometimes in land use. People buy property all the time with a hope that they could do things. If you don't do your due diligence and understand what the legal framework for a piece of property are, or if there's a wetland on the property or some other constraint, I mean, that's part of understanding what the value of a property is. So all of those things come into determining what might be owed or not.
that was good to circle back to that one. We're ready for a couple of managed retreat questions, but a little bit different, and we'll see what other ones there are. Where might managed retreat be possible in Pacifica? What's the danger of prohibiting it as a strategy?
The danger of prohibiting it?
Of prohibiting managed retreat as a strategy. Are there areas that may be possible candidates for that? And what's the danger of saying we're not going to have that as a strategy?
Well, I think I answered that question before. Where could managed retreat happen in Pacifica? That really should be a conversation that comes out of individual dialogues around these proposed SRAs and the mitigations that might be required for those. And so where there's 2 SRAs proposed, maybe, around Beach Boulevard and Rockaway. So maybe the other areas would be possible candidates for managed retreat as ways to offset the exemptions. Just a suggestion to look at that. And then what was the second question?
Well, let me put these two together. Let me read them again to see if they do tie in like I think they do. So here's two different interesting views on cooperation and collaboration. Sounds like existing homes that are in danger of coastline erosion are not a major concern about helping the homeowners to save them, but rather let them fall so we can access the beach. Where is the collaboration? Tied to that is, or I'm going to tie it to that, managed retreat is a loaded term that in itself is negatively biased and perpetuates the humans versus nature paradigm. What about replacing it with something like enlightened cooperation? Would that help? So, but two completely kind of different views, but still talking about how do we get to that collaborative point between, which you talked about, between government agencies and the Coastal Commission and the need to partner and work together. So, but should we be focusing on that more, collaborating together?
Who was that talked about enlightened self-interest? You can't.
Enlightened cooperation
right.
Instead of managed retreat.
Yeah, well, you reminded me of the second question that you asked before. You know, what's the downside potentially of prohibiting managed retreat? And as it relates to collaboration, I'll get to that. I think a downside is that if you don't think about it, you're going to have unmanaged retreat. And so unmanaged retreat, in my mind, is like the worst possible outcome. You're going to have problems with property potentially falling into the ocean anyway, and who's going to be stuck cleaning it up because you didn't prepare for it. So I think, you know, this kind of goes to the physics of what's happening. And I understand that Rosanna Shaw is going to be here, and maybe Gary Griggs. Ask Gary that question. He'll tell you, you can't hold back the Pacific Ocean, right? And I'm just worried that if we don't plan for, call it whatever you want, relocation, realignment,
Cooperative enlightenment.
Cooperative enlightenment.
I like that.
I don't care what you call it. The point is that there's physical development and people in an inherently hazardous, eroding place that is going to be very difficult and expensive to maintain. And so I don't think anyone's, you know, interested. I don't think it's in anyone's interest to let things fall apart. And so to the extent that the question was implying that people are letting that happen, you know, I think everyone needs to take responsibility for the community they've built. It's not any one person's responsibility, but we all have to take responsibility too.
And so for maintaining things, the question is, where in the Coastal Act does it say the Coastal Commission can prevent the city of Pacifica from maintaining its seawall?
Meaning the Beach Boulevard seawall?
Yes.
Well, so the Coastal Act, as I said in the overview, is very broad law. It says things like protect and maximize public access and recreation to and along the shoreline, minimize risk to life and property, and don't approve new development that would in any way require a seawall. I'm simplifying, but broad protections. It says protect sensitive habitat. Well, what does that mean? And the Coastal Commission spends a lot of time defining and figuring out what they consider to be sensitive habitat. Once they find it, and then they protect it. So the Coastal Act doesn't say you can't rebuild a seawall. It says minimize risks to new development, and it says existing development can get a shoreline structure if other things are mitigated. So if you mitigate your impacts to sand supply and public access and all the other things that are supposed to be protected, then you could potentially have a seawall. Whether or not that you can have a seawall in the Beach Boulevard situation will depend on the factors of development and existing structures that are there, and how the Coastal Commission interprets that broad set of policies in that particular case. There are regulations that are a little more specific than the Coastal Act that will help in some cases. Like, for example, there's a definition of a wetland in the regulations. The Coastal Act just says protect wetlands.
And so that's a good segue, thank you. And so it sounds like there's opportunity there to maintain, do some work there on part of Beach Boulevard and everything within that.
I think so. To me, even though I spent a long time, in the role of a regulator, the Coastal Commission is also a planning agency. And so I do think there are situations where, again, going back to the physical reality of what's happening, on our planet and along our shorelines, that it's in our interest to think in a planning frame, not in a regulatory frame, but in a planning frame about what is the best long-term solution in any particular case. And even though the Coastal Act, once you get down to the nitty-gritty with the Coastal Commission, it might be that they recommend approval of something at Beach Boulevard. But even if they do that, it might not be the right thing to be doing, right? It might be more prudent to think about a 50-year time frame or a 75-year time frame and how that situation is going to unfold. Or maybe it is the right thing. There are a lot of places that we're going to be protecting for a long time. San Francisco Airport is working on a huge seawall, right, to protect that airport for 50 years at least.
Again, that long-term vision that we all need to come to that you spoke about. You touched on environmentally sensitive habitat areas, ESHA. So partner questions, does the Coastal Commission still support the environmentally sensitive area habitat provision? And I imagine still support means that we don't develop in those areas. And there's a concern that local governments don't effectively do what the Coastal Commission does in terms of complying with the Coastal Act and protecting sensitive ESHA areas. I know we've had a couple of cases here in Pacifica that were appealed to the Coastal Commission because of that, where a lot of environmental studies weren't done here, so it went to the Coastal Commission with further reports and everything, and that project then was denied because of the environmentally sensitive habitat area. So why do you think local governments don't use that more or take more care in that area? Making you think totally differently, not your hat.
I feel like I'm being set up here. I don't think local governments do that. It really varies. Local governments have a wide variety of practices and things they focus on in their LCPs. And many local governments have very detailed policies and ordinances to protect ESHA, environmentally sensitive habitat. And so there are places where you'll see a lot of attention paid to it. It's sometimes not given enough attention because people just don't understand that there may be a habitat there. I know when I drive up and down the coast now, I see places and I say, oh, that's a wetland. Other people might look at it and say, what wetland? I don't see a wetland. And I'm not a biologist, so biologists will see things that none of us see, right? Or none of the non-biologists. So it can get pretty technical, pretty scientific, and if you don't have a clear LCP that identifies what those sensitive areas are, then you have difficulty in implementation. One of the things we struggled with when I was at the commission was the fact that habitats change over time, as do wetlands. And so some LCPs will map habitats, like, oh, here's the sensitive forest. And then you come back 20 years later and the forest is kind of moved, and then the polygon no longer covers sensitive forests. So what does that mean? You don't protect the forest that is there and only protect the place that doesn't have the forest? No, it means you protect where the forest is. And so we used to say resources on the ground is what matters. So what really should be happening is people going out with experts and identifying what qualifies as sensitive habitat. And as some of you probably know, the Coastal Commission will give you a lot of guidance on that. You know, yeah, that's habitat. Yeah, no, that's habitat. Yeah, that's habitat too.
I had a few questions, by the way, that are about wildlife corridors, things across the highway, and Caltrans lighting. Not really things that we're going to be answering tonight.
But important habitat questions.
Yes,
down at the quarry, the red-legged frog, corridors from one water body to another water body. Lights can affect how the frogs function. So yeah, it's an ESHA question.
And how did you know that I was segueing into I don't know, that, you know, you haven't really, we shared with you about the special resiliency areas, but not really something you've studied much other than being aware of it. Let's see, so I'm going to try to read this one. You mentioned concentration of development in areas where development already exists, yet in the Rockaway special resiliency area, the city is not including the quarry. Wouldn't the quarry be a good mitigator to the protection of existing development in Rockaway?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's been a long time since I thought about the quarry. Maybe. Quarry is what's called, I believe, it's still an ADC. Anyone from the planning department here? Area of deferred certification, meaning it doesn't have an LCP, meaning any development in that area has to go directly to the Coastal Commission. It has that status because at some point back in 1978 or 79, the Coastal Commission and Pacifica couldn't agree about policies for that area. And so it was deferred certification. So one of the things that would need to be thought about was the relationship of that uncertified area to the rest of the LCP area. It's kind of a technicality, but you know, it might be a possibility. I don't know what the latest is there. I know that seems to be proposed for development every 6, 7, 10 years, and then it goes away and then it comes back. And
being proposed very large landfill project to reclaim the quarry right now. So the reclamation plan is what's on the table at the moment, and a lot of dirt being brought in from not quite sure where. So this may be too personal of a question, but could apply to a lot of things, and it's long. My understanding is that Coastal Commission has 2 main points on its mission statement: provide public access to the coast and to preserve sensitive natural habitats and wildlife. The questioner lives and owns a home built in 1954, so pre-Coastal Act, and has lived there since 2002. It's right on a cliff on the ocean. The homeowners originally had a permit to maintain the rock revetment, but that was put in before they purchased the house. So you may be familiar, this is the Shoreview neighborhood, just north of the Sharp Park neighborhood. Revetments need regular maintenance to be effective. As we know, the pounding waves break the rocks over a period of time. There's no public access to the coast along this block, and goes back to pre-Coastal Act, 1950s. And there's no natural habitat to save. There's no beach there, and hasn't been for a long time. There's no cost to any government agency or taxpayer, as the residents pay for that maintenance. Why would the CCC be refusing to issue a maintenance permit? Would that constitute a taking of the property under eminent domain without just compensation, as not being able to maintain that wall would mean that it would become uninhabitable?
I feel like there should be like an A, B, C, D, E set of choices after. It's like an SAT question.
It's a long
right?
one.
It's like, which of the following?
Any thoughts on issuing permits in Shoreview where a rock revetment has existed for a long time? Might there be some reasons why that would be being scrutinized more right now?
I've forgotten the details. There might be a number of reasons. One might have to do with the original permits for the revetment and what restrictions were in those. Another issue that the Coastal Commission has struggled with, and local governments, is the issue of redevelopment. So I briefly described the difference between new development needs to be safe, existing development might be able to get a seawall. But what if you have existing development that redevelops? That's new development. If if you're doing more than like a minor remodel or renovation interior or something, that triggers a new development requirement. So one of the ways the Coastal Commission has tried to get at the issue that there is a revetment there and therefore no beach, and regardless of whether there hasn't been a beach there for a while, there could be a beach there. But what is the trigger for that? Well, it might be that there's something going on with proposals to redevelop. It might be that, and under the regulations, I seem to recall that the Commission doesn't have to issue a permit for maintenance at a minor level if there are certain significant issues being raised. So I don't know what's being talked about, but they could be talking about the specifics of the property.
And might that be that minor repairs are destructive to do the repair work on the beach?
Well, they can be, but the Commission does a lot of permits for repairs and has restrictions about, don't do it at high tide, so at least keep your equipment out of the water and
no debris.
Right.
Cordoning it off.
Best management practices, blah, 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 blah.
And might it be because, here's a question of, will someone be compensated if their neighbor's seawall causes them to lose their access to the coast? So there's the flip side. I don't know.
Yeah, well, again, that goes to private property law and, specific facts. And I suppose it's possible that something your neighbor does triggers a claim that you could bring, but
so we'll just do a few more here and really appreciate your time.
Just one point on that private dynamic. Often the Commission will get appeals that have to do with like somebody building into their view, into a private person's view, and the Commission's always been clear that they protect public views, significant, important public views, that they don't protect a private view. So if the development is merely like putting a second story on consistent with the zoning, and it happens to block the person's view who's interior of that, and it's not a significant public view, then it's not an issue for the Coastal Commission.
Dispute between two property owners.
Right.
On the 40th anniversary of the Coastal Act, a paper was put together by the Center for Ocean Solutions at Stanford with Stanford Environmental Law Journal. And it was called The Unintended Consequences of the Coastal Act and How Might They Be Redressed. The definition of existing under the Act coastal development permit exemptions and the use of emergency permitting issued to protect against non-emergencies were top of their list. And they were hopeful that that could be remedied and clarified finally. If you could go back to 1972 and 1976 when the legislature was shaping that language for the Coastal Act, what would you change or want to see defined better?
You probably want more TV time. I was pretty young back then. The emergency, let me just talk about that for a minute. The emergency provisions of the Coastal Act are there, and they're there for good reasons. You know, emergencies happen, and you need to take action. And you don't want to go through a 6-year review of the Coastal Commission before you deal with your emergency, right? So there are good reasons for that. But along the shoreline, I think many people would agree that the reality is that a lot of shoreline structure development happens under the auspices of emergency permits. A lot of this revetment stuff we see in Pacifica and down in Southern California, that was put in place during emergencies in 1983, 84, El Nino, when a lot of people needed to take action, but there hasn't been any follow-up necessarily, or the follow-up has been basically to approve what was done under an emergency and maybe not planned that well. So there are a lot of cases where emergency permits aren't necessarily the right best outcome. I also think that property owners or people who work with building revetments know that a good time to do a revetment is during a raining storm emergency situation. I mean, so I think the ability to do an emergency approval encourages people to wait until there's an emergency rather than be more proactive about, and the same thing happens at the macro scale too. I'm not saying this is happening, but what do we do? That's how we get into these unmanaged retreat situations, is people are not doing something in advance.
Right.
They're waiting till push comes to shove and you have to do something.
On the part of that question that tied to existing, there's the San Mateo County Superior Court decision that a home down in Miramar here on San Mateo County coast, built in 1984, counts as existing. Do you have an opinion on that? Do you agree with the San Mateo Superior Court that that house built in 1984 counts as existing under the Coastal Act?
Well, personally, I have, I'm not intimately familiar with the facts there, but I've looked at a little bit of it. And as a theoretical matter, I think I'm on record, that I think existing, when the Coastal Act was passed, in my mind, existing meant existing at the time, and that the logic of the act was, as I said a minute ago, existing development can maybe get a seawall. Because we're passing this new law, all these new protections, we recognize that it's not fair to retroactively apply the law. So if you're existing, yeah. But new development shouldn't get a seawall, because we're trying to maximize protection of the natural resources and values of the coast. And so if something was built after the Coastal Act was passed, it falls into the box of new development, not existing.
Another tricky thing with that is the substantial structural modifications and how that impacts what is existing and what isn't. And why does the Coastal Commission want to regulate substantial modifications to a structure to such a strong extent?
So that's what I mentioned a minute ago, and the reason you would do that is to address situations which you might consider non-conforming. And so people may not think about this, but the federal government, by the way, FEMA, has the same rule. Right? If you trigger their 50% redevelopment rule, you need to comply with the floodplain regulations, which means effectively elevating your house 2 feet above or 1 foot above base flood elevation, right? So you're trying to bring development into a better situation with respect to the concern. In the case of shoreline development on an eroding bluff, you're trying to make sure that we don't keep reinvesting in inherently hazardous situations so that it becomes even more difficult to mitigate the impacts of that development. And the substantial
Structural
modifications, I haven't read the proposed ordinances, but that's the idea involved there. At what point would a redevelopment of an existing structure trigger a concern that you're basically making a new structure? I took those slides out of tonight's presentation, but I have a slide where I show houses in 1972 and then today, and they're basically bigger, better, badder, stronger, right? That's California real estate. Things don't come to an end of a life. They are reborn over and over and over. And so if we don't deal with that question, we're deciding that we don't want to change the shoreline configuration.
So our last question that we'll ask, it's 9 o'clock. I appreciate everybody being here. Do we have any others over there that we should be asking? Okay, my question folks are saying, no, we're good. Or anything else out here that hasn't been turned in? Okay. So the Coastal Act is 50 years old, prior to dealing with the climate crisis and even the thought of sea level rise. Isn't it obsolete now? Shouldn't we just be keeping everything in place and no longer protecting the coast? Do people still want the Coastal Act? I know what I think, but...
Well, latest polling, yes, they still want it. The polling has been pretty consistent over the years, both across the parties, obviously not as strong in the Republican business
party.
In the party as Democrats or independents, but pretty strong support for the idea that the Coastal Act is an important thing. And so I'm pretty confident that that's what Californians still want as a whole. And remember, most Californians don't live in the coastal zone. They come to the coastal zone, they enjoy the coastal zone, they understand that the coastal zone is partly theirs, but they don't live here. So why wouldn't you support it? Unless you're, involved in business interests or something that has to routinely struggle to get permits. So yeah, I think there is strong support for it. Is it obsolete? No, I don't think so. Is it perfect? No. Could it be improved? Probably. But I think it's functioned amazingly well when you step back and compare, say, what's happened in California to some other states, like, say, Florida, and see what we've accomplished overall for our coastline, that it's been a good thing.
Okay. Well, long may it live. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really, again, appreciate everybody coming out. We have such an awesome community. I hope that we all keep coming together, talking in a really civil fashion, and come up with a great solution for our city. Lots of meetings from the city to come. So if you're not on that with their website, go to Plan Pacifica. They have a link to sign up and to get notifications when there's different public meetings going on. Yes, we only get our 2 to 3 minutes, but you can send in much longer and more detailed and informative public comment to public comment at pacifica.gov. So another way that you can take part in the process. As mentioned, you saw we're filming this. It's going to be available to watch later or for people who weren't here, and will be posted to our Pacifica's Environmental Family website. And don't forget to mark your calendar for the upcoming March 3rd event with Rosanna Shaw. That's going to be a really great program too. She's super inspiring and motivating. She spent a lot of time here in Pacifica talking to people and to people up and down the California coast that are all dealing with this. So look forward to seeing you at that event when we announce the venue. It'll be an afternoon program. March 3rd is a Sunday. Again, thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.